These days, products are rapidly iterated, right? Especially in the days of technology. Everybody has an opinion. You can't listen to all of them. What are you measuring? And is it making sense eventually?
Hi, Deepak. How are you?
Hey, Muskan, I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. And today I have this really interesting topic, which actually reminds me of something around me being your employee because it's about feedback, which I would always be very scared to get from you, but at the same time, it's very important for my growth. So something similar is with brands. It's a very scary process because you might get to know a lot of, things that you don't want to know about your product or about your product line, but at the same time, it's important for you. So it's like content only. It's a term very loosely referred to these days. But how important exactly is the consumer feedback, Deepak?
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, also when you mention personally in a personal context, it's important to distinguish between feedback and criticism,
Mhm.
right? And feedback is a process to improve, right? Or
Right.
it's a parameter to improve. Primarily because when we are doing a work, whether it's a brand or us ourselves, it's
Mm.
very easy to get lost in our own stories. So feedback is something which ideally is unbiased and it
Mm.
is coming from somebody who has some experience in the field.
Right.
So there is plenty of unjustified feedback, there is plenty of unqualified feedback,
Mm.
but then there is some real feedback which allows you personally to grow and a brand professionally or in the business context to prosper.
Mm.
In terms of a product feedback, it allows a product to develop and iterate.
Right.
Right? So that is what primarily consumer feedback is about. So you have a brand vision
Mm.
and you have executed it in some manner.
Right.
Now, how is the consumer responding to it?
Mm.
That is the feedback which you need in order for your product to grow.
Right. And we have always heard about this loop. So, what exactly is this feedback loop?
I think this feedback loop is a relatively newer concept. And when I say new, it's maybe 10, 20 years old.
Mm.
Usually, what used to happen was since product development used to take such a long time,
Right.
it used to be that you had a complete plan built and this is what I'm going to make. And
Mm.
it will take 2, 3, 4 years to be built. And then it will take another 2 years to get the feedback. And then you will create a new version of the product.
Right.
These days, products are rapidly iterated, right? Especially in the days of technology, which
Mm.
means that today you get somebody gives a feedback that, hey, Muskan, your website, this logo is not looking right.
Mm.
And in 5 minutes, you can change the logo.
Right.
So this is the feedback loop or of releasing it to the market,
Mm.
getting the quote unquote justified feedback,
Right.
and then improving the product to go into the market again to have the feedback.
Right.
So this loop is what allows various companies and various organizations to prosper.
Mm.
And this could be as simple as changing the colors on your website, or it could be as sophisticated as adding new features based on what the consumer is saying.
Right. But is it good? Because I've seen, for example, when I was a college student, we used to get these advertising projects wherein we used to be given brands like Tata Tea or we used to be given brands like Lakme. And we had to basically dissect it and see that, where the consumer feedback matters really. And for these big, large brands, there was one very prominent thing, which was surveys. So that was the traditional thing they used to do to figure out what feedback they're getting. But for these brands itself, it becomes a very PR sort of activity if there is a change, and it becomes a very a big headline in the newspaper that a brand is going to change something or something like that. So is it a good thing now that you can actually iterate your product or line very
I mean,
easily?
for sure, it's not only a good thing. A, it's a required thing,
Right.
and B, the process has become much simpler.
Yeah.
Right. So in surveys, there is a very distinct methodology which used to be followed, but that would depend on the subcontractors you give it to do, the questions you're asking, the people, the incentives the people have in responding. Inherently, that is filled with biases.
True.
Right? These days, since the process is so active and it is sometimes so easily reflected in the revenue which you're generating, that the quality of feedback is much more.
Right.
So if I ask you something that, hey Muskan, how is this looking? And you give a subjective opinion, to quantify that subjective opinion is always difficult. But again, these days, A, it's required feedback, but B, the ease of collecting various qualitative and quantitative parameters is much, much easier. Right? And even things like which colors do your consumers like, which copywriting are they preferring, right? Which features do you see the most adoption for, which features do you see the most retention for, which pages are where you're getting the bounces most, or which pages you're getting retention, right? Retaining the customers most. All of that is much, much simpler. Right? Which is why this process of A/B testing, right? If you go into traditional consumer-based products, such as you talked about Tata Tea, for them to launch multiple products and then do multiple rounds of testing is a huge process.
True.
But for a technology startup or a tech-first startup, it's very easy to create 20 different pages, right? And just see which one is performing the best, and then you take it forward. In fact, if you're familiar with BuzzFeed, right? The organization which really came into the fore with viral news and those headlines, this is what they used to do. They used to create multiple headlines for every story, and then figure out which is working and scale that one up much faster. So the process of feedback, in fact, this is what I keep on referring, right? The colleges are quite dated in terms of what they teach. So when they're teaching you these projects where you're taking a concept and then getting the feedback, that is a method which used to be employed earlier, the days of the print media, right? And these days it's much faster. Even the traditional brands, right? Even brands like, even if you talk about Tata Tea and others, they are seeing a significant percentage of their sales being driven by online platforms.
Right.
Which means the testing is much, much simpler, faster, and more efficient these days. This again improves the quality of feedback.
True. But when we talk about this feedback loop, which is a newer concept, what are these? There must be some areas that we need to focus on when collecting these feedbacks in that loop. There must be some process. What is that?
See, the process eventually, obviously every product would be different. Right. So for certain products, you might only want to get the feedback at the conversion point. But for others, in a technology product, you would be getting a large amount of feedback on the features which you have, features which are performing and features which are not performing. Right. And simply look at any famous mobile app you're using these days. Right? Look at Swiggy or Zomato and see how rapidly they change their home screens.
True.
And that rapidness has come because very easily they're able to validate what is working, what is not working, where should I move the menu to, where should I move the most suggested products to. So individually, where should you focus on a feedback? It depends on what you're trying to improve. Right? If the product itself is pretty fluid, obviously you're testing at multiple points. But again, you're right. It's pretty easy to get lost in the volume of feedback. And we have not yet talked about right, just a bad quality feedback, which is you're reaching out to consumers who are not your target consumers.
Right.
If you are creating an app for Gen Z and the feedback you're getting is from a different generation, obviously it's not going to be useful. And you might simply go on iterating in the wrong direction. So apart from what points of feedback to focus on, you also have to focus on which feedback to take. Right. And again, we live in India, so everybody is pretty ready to give you opinions. But which opinion you should really listen to and test out, and which you should, just let go. That is also a decision which most people have to make.
I guess my next question was around this only, because it's very scary out there that, you always look at feedback as something that you can, bring a change in your product with. So many feedbacks out there, and how to really dissect whether this feedback would be critical for my growth or that. How do we do that? How do brands?
How do you distinguish between feedback and opinion?
Yeah.
Right. So that is pretty individual. Everybody has an opinion.
True.
Right. And everybody thinks that their opinion is a fact. Right. But again, this goes more into the philosophical realm. But if everybody has an opinion, you can't listen to all of them, much less act on all of them.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to have some measure of trust and belief that, okay, this person's feedback is not only well meant, but it is also probable to be valid given his or her experience and exposure to the industry.
But is it possible that you lose your thought or you lose these important feedbacks amongst a very wide range of these gray feedbacks, which you don't really need?
Absolutely. That is the noise, right? This is the signal to noise ratio. So if you keep on listening to the noise, you will also not be able to figure out where the signal was, where the right feedback was.
Yeah.
Which is why simply collecting feedback for feedback's sake is not a good process. And again, we are going into that philosophical realm, but that is why having some bit of confidence in your own product is almost always necessary. Because when people give you feedback, it may not always be valid. So there is some amount of brute forcing through your vision.
Yeah.
Yes, you have to listen to the audience. Yes, you have to listen to the consumer. But many times, you can't listen to, they don't know the vision which you have. Right? So you have to understand the feedback in the context of who is giving it, what is their intention, and are they the right person to give the feedback.
And when I talk about some changes that we have come a long way from these traditional ways that we had. So what are these measurement tools really similar to back then also, that how we used to measure feedback, or is it somehow changed?
Oh, it's exponentially better these days, right? Just, if you have looked at again, you host that podcast, Champions of D2C.
Right.
D2C is built upon performance marketing. Right. And when we talk about performance marketing, which Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Google do so well these days, is that you can really find out what was the customer's flow, which customer came to which page, how many of customers resulted into revenue, what was the ROI, what was the ROAS. So the measures have improved tremendously, right? But consequently, the volume of feedback is also much larger.
Right.
So while you're measuring everything, then you get into deeper technical issues. For example, there is an issue of dual or duplicated attribution. So you might have a conversion on your, let's say, Shopify store, and Facebook is saying it was my conversion and Google is saying it was my conversion.
Right.
And you have to figure out how many days conversion limits you have set, which was the last point of conversion, how do you measure it? So these things become more technical. The quality of collecting feedback is definitely improved. But with that, it now requires much more skill in navigating the amount of feedback.
Right.
And importantly, there is still a value of qualitative feedback. So there is still some things which technology cannot measure.
True.
So how do you incorporate that into your product definition? Right? So it requires some bit of thought into it. It cannot simply be something like an Excel sheet which is being done.
I guess with feedbacks, it's really crucial because it's, consumers' thoughts, and it could be related to their emotions and mood as well. So if they don't like a product, it could be anger or anything. And to distinguish and measure them is really difficult. You cannot measure emotions really. So I guess that way you're right.
Right. And so some amount of that, again, with the increase in technologies, you can actually figure out statistically what is I have to take out of it.
Yeah.
Statistically, how I remove biases, statistically, which customer segment should I focus to. So all of that is there. It's improving. But again, the huge amount of data thereby necessitates that you understand what is that feedback loop you're following. What are you measuring? And is it making sense eventually? Right? You can't simply keep on changing and pivoting just because someday some data is saying something.
Right. And eventually it leads to some growth, which I also personally, it led me to. So
yeah, that is the objective of any feedback, right? Which is where differentiating feedback, opinion, facts, criticism is a pretty important skill,
right?
Both in terms of growing a brand, but also in terms of personal growth, right? And especially, as I said, right, we have a tendency to really give opinions to everyone,
True.
right? And which has its own complications.
It's a debate on its own. But I guess that's it for now. And it was a really great conversation with you, Deepak. Thank you so much for gracing us on this podcast. Thank you.
Thanks, Muskan. Lovely to chat with you. Thank you.